He was a billionaire who had everything: power, money, respect. But one stormy night, his car crashed, flames surrounded him, and death was seconds away. And then, he was saved. Not by a friend, not by his wealth, but by a homeless man the world had forgotten. That night didn't just save his life, it changed his soul forever. The city was alive that night, its towers glowing like monuments of ambition against the darkness. Among those towers, the tallest belonged to Richard Harlow, a man whose name echoed through boardrooms and news headlines alike. Richard was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire that stretched across industries, commanding influence like a king on his throne. Yet for all the glass, steel, and power that surrounded him, he had built walls even higher around his own heart. Richard was the kind of man who believed in control, precision, and absolute dominance. His life was measured in profits and losses, in mergers and acquisitions. To him, people were assets or liabilities, numbers on spreadsheets, never souls with stories. Success had hardened him, and in the pursuit of wealth, compassion had been sacrificed long ago. That night he was driving home after a gala where his presence was celebrated like royalty. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement as rain began to drizzle. Inside the luxury car, Richard's mind replayed the evening's triumph. A new deal sealed, another rival crushed. He poured himself a drink from the minibar and allowed a rare smile to surface. But arrogance is a dangerous companion on slippery roads. Just outside the downtown core, his car sped too fast along a curve. A sharp turn, a flash of water across the asphalt, and the machine that had always obeyed him suddenly betrayed his grip. In a heartbeat, the tires screeched, the car swerved, and Richard felt the world spin out of control. The vehicle crashed against the guardrail, twisted, and tumbled down the embankment. Glass shattered, metal screamed, and his empire's ruler was reduced to a man trapped in steel and fire. Smoke filled his lungs as he struggled to breathe. Panic rose within him, something he had never allowed himself to feel. His phone had flown out of reach, his body pinned by the crushed frame of his luxury. For the first time in decades, Richard Harlow felt powerless. As his vision blurred and the flames hissed closer, a shadow emerged through the storm. It was not a rescuer in uniform, not a driver who had stopped out of duty. It was a man dressed in rags, his hair unkempt, his face weathered by hunger and nights spent under bridges. A homeless wanderer whom Richard, in his other life, would never have noticed. The man moved quickly, his strength surprising. With hands scarred and dirty, he pried open the door, ignoring the flames licking his skin. He pulled Richard out, dragging him onto the wet ground just as the car erupted into fire. Richard gasped for air, his chest pounding, his tailored suit torn and stained. He looked at the figure before him, the savior he would have once dismissed as invisible. But before he could speak, before he could even comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened, the homeless man slipped back into the shadows. No name. No thanks. Just silence, as though he were a ghost who had appeared only to save him. Richard lay there, shivering in the rain, staring at the burning wreckage of his car. He realized in that moment that all the money, all the power, had not saved him. His life had been spared by someone who had nothing, and for the first time in his life, Richard Harlow felt small. The chapter of his empire was still intact, but the chapter of his heart had been forced open, and he knew this was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the accident became headline news. Billionaire CEO survives fiery crash. Reporters speculated about his survival, but the details of how he escaped remained a mystery. Richard gave no interviews. He told no one about the man who had saved him. To speak of it would have been to admit vulnerability, and Richard Harlow had built his image on being invincible. But deep within, his thoughts were consumed by the shadow in the rain, the man who had risked his life for a stranger, and not just any stranger, but a man who represented everything society had denied him. Richard remembered the strength in his hands, the urgency in his actions, and the quiet dignity in his disappearance. He began to see the city differently. Where once he noticed only the glass towers and financial centers, now his eyes caught the corners of streets, the bridges, the hidden places where the forgotten gathered. For the first time, he noticed the homeless, The men and women he had dismissed as background noise were now faces, each carrying stories he could not ignore. Richard sent his people to investigate. He quietly funded outreach centers, hoping that word of a homeless hero might surface. He visited shelters in disguise, his expensive suits traded for plain coats, as he tried to walk the streets unnoticed. Yet days turned to weeks, and the man remained elusive, as though he had returned to the shadows where he belonged. The search did something unexpected to Richard. It began to soften him. The more he walked among the forgotten, the more he realized how fragile the line was between his world and theirs. He met veterans who had once commanded soldiers but now begged for change. He met mothers who had lost jobs, fathers who had lost homes, children who dreamed of warmth. And he realized that he, the man who owned towers, had never truly seen the streets at their base. The face of his rescuer haunted him at night. He would wake in cold sweats, imagining the man trapped in the fire instead of him. The guilt pressed heavily. Why had someone with nothing risked everything for him? And what had he done with his life in comparison? One evening, as he sat in his office overlooking the city skyline, Richard made a decision. His life had been given back to him, and he could not waste it. He vowed that if he ever found the man again, he would not only repay him, but also change himself. The next morning, he instructed his team to prepare a new initiative, one that would dedicate resources to uplifting the homeless community. It was not charity, he told them, but justice. For once, his empire would be used to rebuild lives, not just profits. But even as the projects began to roll out, the man himself remained missing. And in that absence, Richard began to feel something he had never known before: humility. The accident had broken his illusion of control. The search had broken his illusion of superiority, and both were leading him toward a truth he was not yet ready to face. For destiny, he would soon learn, had not finished writing the story of the homeless man and the billionaire. It was a winter morning when Richard finally found him. A charity event his company sponsored had drawn in many from the streets, offering warmth, food, and shelter for a day. As Richard moved among the crowd, his eyes locked on a familiar figure sitting quietly in the corner. The weathered face, the rough hands, the weary eyes. It was him. Time seemed to freeze. Richard approached, his heart pounding, unsure of what to say. The man looked up, recognition flickering for a moment, but then he lowered his gaze as if embarrassed by the attention. He had not saved a billionaire for reward or recognition. He had simply saved a life. Richard did not speak of gratitude in grand words. He did not summon cameras or press. Instead, he sat beside the man, silent, humbled. In that silence, he felt a connection more powerful than any contract he had ever signed. Two men from opposite worlds, bound by one night in the rain. From that day on, Richard ensured the man's life changed. He arranged a home, medical care, opportunities to rebuild. But more than material gifts, he offered respect, something the man had been denied by the world for too long. And in return, the man gave Richard something even greater: perspective. The billionaire who once measured worth in wealth began to measure it in humanity. He transformed his company into a force for social good, creating programs that offered jobs and dignity to those society had cast aside. The towers of his empire no longer stood as monuments of greed, but as beacons of hope. Richard's story spread quietly, not as a press release, but as whispers of change. Employees felt the difference. Communities felt the difference. And at the center of it all was the lesson he had nearly died to learn, that the value of a man is not in what he owns, but in what he gives. Years later, when Richard spoke to young leaders, he often told them the same truth. He would not speak of market strategies or balance sheets, but of a winter night when a man with nothing had given him everything. The story of the homeless man and the billionaire did not end with riches or fame. It ended with redemption, of a soul, of a heart, of a purpose. And it began, as most great transformations do, in the moment when one life touches another and changes it forever.